Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Algae Biomass Summit in its first ever virtual format. The summit theme this year is Algy 2020, Sustainable Scalable Solutions. This theme exemplifies the current state of the industry, an industry that is well posed to provide needed solutions to the world today. My name is Valerie Harmon, and I'm the president of Harmon Consulting, Inc., a firm focused on bridging gaps in algae technology development. I am proud to be the program chair for this year's summit. The algae industry is ready to provide sustainable solutions to our global food and animal feed crisis, ready for mitigation of climate issues such as wastewater remediation and carbon capture, and ready to provide alternatives to petroleum-based chemicals used in manufacturing. Our exceptional program content will provide the opportunity for you to learn more about how technology development in the algae industry will contribute to future solutions so desperately needed. The summit is divided into 3 distinct sections: industry spotlight panels, keynotes, and plenaries, and technical sessions. For the first time, the Algae Biomass Summit is pleased to offer industry spotlight panels covering important topics such as effective market entry into animal feed markets, algae-based polymers, and crop insurance, to name a few. These panels will be running as Zoom meetings starting today and running through September 1st. Please be sure to attend these captivating panels and take advantage of the networking opportunities following each of these sessions in the Whova app. You've received a link to this app as part of your registration. The app can be downloaded to your phone and your desktop. The week of September 8th through the 11th, the summit will continue with exciting keynote speakers from Oceans 2050, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Energy. There will be plenary sessions ranging from algae in foods and feeds to algae biofoundries, as well as vast opportunities for continued networking via the Whova app. During this portion of the summit, exhibitors will also be present in a virtual exhibit hall to highlight their contributions to our industry's growth and success. The exhibit hall can be accessed on the Whova app. From September 4th through October 2nd, the Algae Biomass Summit will offer a diverse and stimulating schedule of technical sessions covering advances in engineering and analysis, biology, products and markets, as well as finance, policy, and education. There will also be an opportunity to participate in virtual tours of algae-focused businesses, and of course, continued opportunities to network via the Whova app. Please note that in each and every panel or session, you will have the opportunity to participate in live chats with panelists and attendees, ask questions to the panelists and speakers via the Q&A feature, and to participate in follow-up networking opportunities via the Whova app. I must say that going virtual with the summit this year presented its share of challenges, but our team was focused and committed to success. I want to extend a very sincere thank you to the Algae Biomass Summit Program Committee that worked tirelessly with me this year to ensure the summit would provide exceptional content to our attendees. I also want to acknowledge the Algae Biomass Organization Board of Directors and staff for their tireless support to move to a virtual format, as well as the support staff from the University of California, San Diego, that despite the summit going virtual, continue to support our success. Thank you all very much. Please sit back and prepare for the extensive opportunities provided over the next 8 weeks in this year's Algae Biomass Summit, Algy 2020, Sustainable, Scalable Solutions. I now want to introduce Jill Johnson-Kaufman, the chair of the Algae Biomass Organization and the head of Algae Ingredients Global Market Development for Corbion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Valerie, and thanks so much for your incredible leadership and the time and the effort that you've put into this year's ABO Summit. And on behalf of the ABO Board of Directors, I want to welcome all of the participants today and for our opening session of the 2020 ABO Summit. Our 7-week program is going to be outstanding, as Valerie outlined for us, and offers a diversity and depth of topics and of speakers. I want to thank our Summit Program Committee for their hard work in reviewing a lot of abstracts, let's say, and putting together this exceptional program. So I'd like to introduce Rebecca White, ABO Senior Advisory, to introduce our 101 session. And I should check, is Rebecca here?
Hi, Jill, I am on the line.
Oh, great. Why don't we'll just take you with audio instead of visual, if that's okay with everyone.
Thanks very much, Jill. I do apologize to everyone here in northern New Mexico. We've had significant internet problems over the past 3 months, so I beg your forgiveness for not appearing on screen, but I appreciate you listening to my introduction. I want to welcome you to Algy 101. This is one of my favorite sessions at the summit every year. We've had Algy 101 for a number of years, and we've covered various topics, introducing audiences to the countless opportunities that are being created in the algae industry. In past years, we've heard how algae is making its mark in food, nutrition, water treatment, advanced materials, energy, and many other markets. We've heard from producers, we've heard from end users, we've heard from technology specialists, and Algy 101 is a very special session where people can get introduced to what's going on in the industry. Today's Algy 101 is modeling for financial success. This Algy 101 session is designed specifically for individuals that want to either take an algal concept to commercialization or to understand the algal business to provide investment or financing opportunities. This session will address important business and finance topics as the algae industry continues to expand commercially and to add new and innovative products to the market. In some cases, the products are new, and in other cases, algae have been used to replace current commodities to enhance the product for better performance, to be more environmentally friendly, or to be more economical. And today, our Algy 101 panel is led by Tom Byrne, who's an ABO board member and the Treasurer Secretary, and who is tax manager at Carlson SV. His leadership and commitment to the algae industry began with his involvement with co-hosting the inaugural Algae Biomass Summit and the second summit way back in 2008. These summits were the foundation for ABO, and we've been very fortunate to have Tom's long support as well as that of his firm, Carlson SV. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tom to introduce our panel and to start the session. Thank you all for joining.
Okay, thank you, Valerie, Jill, Rebecca. I want to welcome everybody to Algy 101, where we've taken a slightly different approach this year, as Rebecca has pointed out. Our first speaker today really needs no introduction. He has spoken at several of the previous summits. I would like to welcome James Drage from Canada. Take it away.
Well, thanks to Tom, Valerie, the ABO, and everyone who's attending today. My name is James Drage. I'm a venture capitalist in Canada, and one that is actually interested in algae. And so today, for Algy 101, Modeling for Financial Success, I'm going to talk about what it would take, or what it should take, to get investors interested in algae. I made my first algae investment in 2010, and I've made 8 more since then. And I want to give a quick introduction to the way that at least I think investors see algae. And so, we start with the question of what does financial success mean for algae? And for this question, I answer it the same way for every business, is that it really means the right capital at the right time to allow the things that need to happen to occur. And for algae, that means, I think, R&D, commercialization, scaling, growth, and sustainability. And so that right capital really means the amount of money to do those items for 12 to 18 months. We don't want to run out of money before we hit some milestones or complete the tasks that we need to get the outcomes and the results that we're looking for. And we want it to be the right form. We want it to be either equity or a grant or debt that supports the project. We want it to be from a provider that could be a value add, meaning it's not just about the money, but they can do some other things to help move the project along. And we want it to be from a source that is the right source, meaning that it can add more capital as time goes on, or provide more connections, more people, those things that would allow it to increase value. And at the right time means not too early, not too late. We sometimes call that the Goldilocks principle. It always takes longer to raise money than we think. And we don't want capital that comes in a way that delays or interferes in any way with the work that we need to do. And so, the algae industry from an investor viewpoint is an interesting one. Not everyone at ABO will agree with the way I'm going to portray this, but algae really starts, as an industry around World War II, the 1950s, 60s through the 90s. There was certainly lots going on in algae. But from an investor standpoint, it really starts with what I call Algae 1.0, which was roughly the year 2000 through the end of the decade. And during that period of time, it was a hype fest. Hundreds of millions of dollars were invested in algae because of unrealistic pitches that were made around mostly biofuels. The one big win that came out of this time period is that the ABO itself was founded, which really started to professionalize the industry. That was followed by Algae 2.0, which I'll roughly say again was the decade from 2010 through the end of last year. During that decade, there were lots of failures and losses in the algae industry, particularly among businesses that have been backed by outside investors. There was a withdrawal of venture capital because of that. And the pitches that we started to hear as investors were what I would qualify as unexciting. And it was mostly about a shift to co-products, which is great, but it was done in a way that failed to excite venture capitalists. And we'll talk about why that is in a few minutes. But first, I want to talk about my hope, which is that, starting this year, we're entering what I would like to call Algae 3.0. And during this decade, I think there's a real potential for venture capital to return, for there to be plentiful investment, where technology can help make exponential growth possible in algae businesses. And so that we can have both exciting and realistic pitches that are investor worthy. And the way we get there is by creating exits that create returns, that create an investable asset class. During those era 1 and era 2 times, we had big companies like Solazyme or Sapphire or Alginol. They weren't complete failures. They allowed us to learn and build on the lessons that they taught us. They're still contributing to the industry today, but investors lost money in them, and that's a bad thing. And so, VCs to come back, we really need to understand what it is that venture capital funds need, how they work. And so they take investment from limited partners. They typically get that money for 10 to 12 years, and this would come from pension fund and high net worth individuals and investment groups like hedge funds and so on. And 10 to 12 years later, they're really looking to get the principal amount they contributed back with annualized rates of return of 20% per year. And so over a 10 to 12 year period, that's a lot of money. And so given that 7 out of 10 investments that VCs make fail, that means that the 3 or 2 or even just 1 success needs to be at least 10 times the money. And if you're not a VC, that might sound like a lot or a little, but here's the reality with VC. They want to know, what will this business be when my investment matures? The correct answer, as I said, is 10 times the amount we invested. But we have to put that into some context. You think about a VC that gives you $10 million to help your algae business grow. They're going to be looking to get at least $100 million back. But for that $10 million, they may have only gotten 30% of the business. That means the business would have to sell for $300 million. And so, if they gave you 10 million today and got 30% of the business, that would mean the business was worth roughly $30 million. And we're looking to take this business from $30 million today up to $300 million at some point in the future. Not a lot of businesses do that, and even fewer have this potential for 100x or 1000x. And so what happens is, to get the money, often people tell stories that are unrealistic. We need the stories or the pitches to be done in a way that is realistic and defensible. I don't have a lot of time to get into how to do that during Algy 101, but I am speaking again on September 24th, and I'll go into more details then. For now, what we really want to talk about is, how do you get money for an algae idea? And it's really about the story you tell and how you tell it. Ben Horowitz, who is a very famous venture capitalist, says the company story is the company strategy. In that Algy Era 101, what came out of that was, headlines that would talk about an algae bubble, and companies that had a strategy of, I don't know how I'm going to solve this problem, but if you give me enough money, I hope I will be able to figure it out. And you've probably heard that expression, that hope is not a strategy. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but my favorite pitch method that you can review when you get these slides later is to tell a attraction story. Show people that this is inevitable and that the outcome can be big in a way that is believable, and make them fall in love with you and the team. Tell them why you're the right people to do this. Show them that this team and this right people also has a plan to get there. That step 1 leads to step 2, to step 3, to step 4, and then ultimately success. And then make sure you know exactly how much you want, what you're going to use the money for, and that using that money will make value creation in the company that will make a next investment round or an exit inevitable. You don't need to do it exactly that way, but you need to make sure you answer all those questions. And while you're doing that, I'll say, don't be afraid to tell a contrarian story. Peter Thiel, another famous venture capitalist who was one of the co-founders of PayPal, likes to say, ask yourself a contrarian question. And that is, what is something you believe to be true that most people believe to be false? If I look at me for Algy, one of the things I believe is that, today there are really just dozens or maybe in the low hundreds of algae farms or algae businesses, that over the next decade we'll get to hundreds of algae businesses, and later thousands, and then eventually perhaps tens of thousands of algae businesses and algae farms that are profitable and worth supporting. Once you've pitched the investor in this way, the investor really makes a yes or no decision. And that can be done 4 possible ways. Positive, they invested and it leads to an exit. Negative, they invested and the company later fails. A false positive, where they invested, but then the company failed. That was what happened with most of the Algy 1.0 era investments. And then a false negative, which is really what we want to happen even more than the positives, which is an investor who rejects a company that later becomes a success, and so they missed out on it. And like all investors, venture capitalists flock to hot areas, and fear of missing out is powerful. So what should Algy people tell VCs for Era 3.0 to become a reality? Again, there's lots of ways we could go into this. I think the main thing is that Algy is a platform technology. There's lots of things we can do with it. The last 2 companies that I invested in for Algy, one is making growth factors for cultured meats, and another one is using Algy as a platform to grow essentially the ingredients for pharmaceuticals or drugs. The point is to pitch things that are proven, but that need capital to scale, not guesses with a slim chance of being true. And so, I really think that Algy 4.0 can come in the decade after, and it'll even be more exciting. And so, look, to end here, congratulating an entrepreneur for raising capital is like congratulating a fisherman for buying the bait. And what we need to do as the professionals in the algae industry is to become good bait. We need to make sure that we're worth being picked so that we can get the money, so that we can create the Algy 3.0 potential. And so This was a really quick overview. There's not a lot of time in a 101 session to go deep, but I hope you learned something today. And if you have any questions, please ask them during the Q&A or feel free to reach out to me at james@algy.vc. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Our next up, we have David Ramjan. David holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology and a Master of Science in Environmental Studies, focusing on policy and law. With over 20 years of experience in sustainable development and environmental and natural resource management. He won the 2004 Bishop Robert Smith Award from the College of Charleston in South Carolina, and in 2002, Betty Spence Conservation Award from South Carolina Wildlife Federation. David belongs to the Phi Kappa Phi Honor Society, Golden Key Honor Society, and National Society of Collegiate Scholars. He is recently inducted in 2019 edition of Marcus Who's Who in America. He's a member of the Algy Biomass Organization, serving on the ABO Education and Communication Committees, and is a member of the Phycology Society of America. Take it away.
Hello, Tom, my fellow presenters, and those viewing from all parts of the globe. I'm happy to be presenting again at the opening session of the Algy Biomass Organization's signature event, the first virtual Algy Biomass Summit. I'll be sharing what I consider to be the critical lessons I have learned along the way. The algae business has many fundamental issues in common with any business. However, the differences with algae business are hardly ever taught in a classroom or textbook. I hope to fill some of those gaps. It would have been nice to know a lot of this instead of learning the hard way. To LLC or not to LLC. Choosing the business structure lays the foundation for everything else. It determines all subsequent plans, policies, systems, etc. What business structure should you use? How does structure affect taxation? What legal reporting obligations does each structure have? Sole proprietorship, partnership, limited liability company, corporation, or joint venture. Corporate governance. Poor corporate governance can weaken a company's potential, can lead to financial difficulties, and in some cases can cause long-term damage to a company's reputation. A company which applies the core principles of good corporate governance, those being fairness, accountability, responsibility, and transparency, will usually outperform other companies and will be able to attract investors whose support can help to finance further growth. Legal considerations. These govern internal and external factors. For example, licensing, contracts, non-disclosure agreements, terms of service, privacy policies, company operating agreements for valuation, transfers, ownership, structure, etc. Internal policies such as compliance with statutory requirements, intellectual property such as patents, trademarks, copyright, trade secrets, and legal action such as lawsuits and injunctions, either as plaintiff or defendant. Laws governing business operations such as employment laws, OSHA, taxation laws. These are all quite important. Finance and accounting. Finance typically focuses on planning and directing the financial transactions for the company, while accounting focuses on recording and reporting on those transactions. Parts of finance and accounting include business plans, financial plans, income statements, balance sheets, statement of equity and equity changes, cash flows, budgets, use of proceeds, accounts, bookkeeping, controls for accounts and bookkeeping. Attracting investments. not an easy thing to do. Investors hardly invest in companies that aren't already making a profit. But you cannot attract investors without good corporate governance, without the right corporate structure, without proper legal systems, or internal finance and accounting systems and controls. Key components or considerations include pitch decks, projections. What types of investment are you going after? Equity or debt? Convertible notes? Have you done a fair market evaluation of your company? Are you going into the capital markets? What is the cost of capital? What is the burn rate that you have? What are your exit strategies? And my favorite, free money or non-dilutive finance, if you can find it. Then there's the human element, perhaps the most important yet least controllable factor in success. Ensure that your employment manuals and policies are thorough, and also ensure to get buy-in of your vision, mission, and core values. Your people can make or break you. The unknown unknowns. Think COVID-19. None of us were prepared for that. But in the algae business, there are also emergent problems when you're scaling up from lab to field. Technology issues, process issues, changing legislation, changing policies, new barriers to trade in algae products or services, whether they be tariff or non-tariff barriers, public perception and acceptance, competition, who's doing it better, faster, cheaper. All of these you will not know until you know. Following will be some industry considerations for investors, associations, academia, governments, and entrepreneurs. Recommendations for investors. Many founders don't know how to run a business. Many founders should not be running a business. All algae business opportunities are not the same, so they should not be judged on the same basis, nor by past failures. The industry requires patient capital. Overnight success never happens overnight. Be a strategic partner, not just an investor. Mentor, guide, facilitate, based on your business acumen, on your expertise, your experience, your capabilities, and your networks. Learn algae basics. Forewarned is forearmed. Less disappointments, less gullibility. Can algae really do all that we say it can? Absolutely. Will it happen overnight? Absolutely not. For industry associations, if you charge a fee for membership, then you must deliver value for that membership. Lobby on behalf of the industry. For example, the Algae Biomass Organization spends a significant amount of time and resources to achieve industry facilitating legislation, policies, and funding. Visit their website to learn about the Farm Bill, carbon tax credits, the proposed Algae Center of Excellence. Join and tell the ABO what you need to help your business. I joined in 2013 and made my voice heard, and I'm seeing the benefits now. Provide business resources to algae companies. Links to marketing, research, legal, investment, etc., specific to the algae industry. Conduct algae industry workshops for more interactive learning experiences. Change public perception and raise awareness of the algae industry, its benefits, value, and potential. Provide specific support and opportunities to small and startup algae companies. The folks who start up with millions of dollars of investment don't need this as much as the little guys. Facilitate data and information sharing. Establish databases and clearinghouses. Create mechanisms for information flows between and among academia, industry, and government. Develop incubators and accelerators with mature industry players. For academia. Academia is mostly where new ideas, science, and technology originates. But academia is also where we train the next generation of workers for the algae industry. Training individuals how to think is more valuable to the algae industry, especially when dealing with emergent problems or unknown unknowns. Develop curricula, collaborate with businesses on the areas of research, promote public-private partnerships, establish industry advisory boards, encourage your students, technical majors, to take entrepreneurship electives, educate, educate, educate. To government, facilitate algae entrepreneurship through legislation, policy, and public spend. Stimulate and incentivize private sector engagement and investment in the algae industry. Level the playing field for algae. Treat it the same as fossil hydrocarbons or renewable energy. Fund innovative applications of algae. Increase funding for research, development, demonstration, and deployment of algae biotech. Recognize algae's ability to fix the problems we know exist and those we can anticipate. Act now. And most importantly, don't politicize environmental issues. And to the most important folks, the algae entrepreneurs. Unless you have the capital to support the foray into biofuels, don't. Figure out your unique selling proposition first. Profit is not a four-letter word. Be the solution to a problem that a lot of people want solved. Hire the best people and stay out of their way. Cash flow is king. Get to revenue and profits as quickly as possible. Don't overpromise and underdeliver. Hype kills. Have a business plan and be able to articulate your plan. Establish good corporate governance, transparency and accountability, compliance with regulations, and communicate with your stakeholders, clients, regulatory agencies, and the general population. Avoid undercapitalization. Know what it will cost to get to profitability and secure that capital up front. Practice ecocentric business. People are not separate from planet. Network, network, network. Reinvent, innovate, adapt, learn and evolve. No man is an island, and don't cling to a mistake just because you spent a lot of time making it. Market and sell. They are not the same thing. And finally, in closing, the algae industry doesn't have much of a science and technology problem anymore. It has more of a business problem. Getting from experiment to income streams must be the focus. Don't give up. I end with references on the last 3 slides. I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, David. You mentioned questions. We are getting questions to show up. I encourage anybody that has questions to submit them on the Q&A portion. We are getting questions. We'll handle them at the end. Our next presenter grew up in the sunny state of Florida, but after getting too much sun, decided he needed and moved to a quite as sunny state in Washington for college. After receiving his bachelor in biology and a dual concentrations of marine and molecular biology, he wisely and quickly moved back to Florida, where he is now in business development executive for Burdock Group, an ingredient safety and regulatory consulting firm. His role, he has helped many ingredient innovators navigate the complex regulatory requirements to bring their product to market. In addition to his responsibilities as Burdock Group, he is a self-proclaimed health junkie. He enjoys running, backpacking, scuba diving, and a good cup of tea. Addressing the regulatory portion of our LG 101 panel, I'd like to introduce Janelle Lagabon from Burdock Group. Take it away.
Hello and welcome to my section of Algy 101. My name is John Lagabon. I'm a business development executive at Burdock Group, and the title of my presentation is Overcoming U.S. Regulatory Hurdles for Novel Food, Feed, and Dietary Supplement Ingredients. These are the sections of my presentation today. The first is setting the scene, where I will answer the question of what is food. The second is pathways to compliance, which I've broken it down to first establishing the concept of what gets approved, as well as talking about the two major approval pathways, which are GRAS versus FAP. And the third is I will answer the question of which path works best for your novel ingredient. Okay, what is food? U.S. Code defines food as articles used for food or drink for man or other animals, chewing gum, and articles used for components of any such article. If we break this down, Part 1 basically states that food regulation applies to humans and animals, and Part 3 basically means that any ingredients or additives are subject to food regulation. Before we move forward, I'd like to establish a very important concept, which is that your claims dictate your category. Now, as you can see, we've defined food earlier on the left, but the definition for dietary supplements are a product intended for ingestion that contains a dietary ingredient intended to further the nutritional value to supplement the diet, as well as articles other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals. Now, as you can see, dietary supplement is a subcategory of food, meaning that food regulations apply to dietary supplements, but not all dietary supplement regulations apply to all food. Now, as you look to the right, you can see the category for drug, and the definition for it is articles intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Now, while this may seem like a very far-fetched category or not unrelated to food, it is, in the sense that your claim dictates your category. If your food or dietary supplement makes the relatively seemingly innocuous claim of saying, oh, this lowers heart disease or this prevents cancer, you are automatically you are basically implying that your product is a drug. Therefore, you are subject to drug regulation. So, in order to stay within food and dietary supplement regs and categories, you need to make sure you're very careful about your claims and what you say about your product. Another key concept to establish is how regulators view categories versus marketers. Now, you may have seen the terms nutraceuticals, aquaceuticals, but regulators do not have distinct categories for them. In many cases, nutraceuticals or aquaceuticals are, in fact, dietary supplements and are subject to dietary supplement regulations. Before we really get into the pathways of compliance, I'd like to establish this very important concept. And it starts with asking the question, what gets approved? There's a common misconception that once an ingredient is GRAS or a food additive, it's approved. Well, that's not entirely true. What's approved is not the ingredient, but the ingredient's safe use. What that means is that there are conditions and data that support a certain usage of the ingredient. For example, if there's a GRAS for spirulina that has data that shows that it's safe for human consumption at 10 milligrams per kg a day, and the expert panel approves this, then the following are not GRAS. If you use spirulina at 20 milligrams per kg a day, it's not compliant because it exceeds the acceptable daily intake that was approved. Even if you use it at 11 or 10.5 milligrams per kg a day, that is not technically GRAS and it's not compliant. Another instance where that is not GRAS is using spirulina for cattle. The GRAS that has been established that we discussed only has it shown safe for human consumption at 10 milligrams per kg a day. The data does not support safety for cattle or poultry. Now that we've established that key concept, let's talk about some of the compliance pathways for novel ingredients. There are two pathways for novel ingredient compliance in the US. The first is a food additive petition, and the second is a generally recognized as safe designation. In the interest of time, we won't be addressing GRAS via history of use, and we'll be talking about GRAS by scientific procedures. Food additive petition is an FDA approval and rulemaking process that requires scientific data that fulfills the criteria of what is called the Red Book. Once you fulfill that criteria and drafted your narrative of safety, you will submit your dossier to FDA, where there will be a proposed rule and comment period, much like a rule, making a rule. And after that period is over and it's approved, the final rule will come out in the Federal Register and you have an approved food additive. FDA states that it takes about 3 to 5 years, but from our experience, it usually takes about 5 to 8 years. And in some extreme cases, up to 12 years for aspartame and 15 years for Olestra. This is not a short pathway. Like an FAP, generally recognized as safe still requires a safety narrative. However, the approval process is different. Instead of sending your dossier directly to FDA and waiting for approval, you have to meet the general recognition of safety, and that's done in 2 ways. The first is that you must publish all the safety data in a peer-reviewed journal so that scientists can comment and review whether or not your data is actually accurate and if it's high quality. Second is that there's an expert panel that reviews your dossier. And once they review the dossier and sign it, technically, you are compliant with federal law and your ingredient is generally recognized as safe. At that point, you can sell. And that process from getting your dossier reviewed is about 90 days, which is significantly shorter than an FAP. Now, there is also the optional step of notifying the FDA. While it's not required, many clients opt to do it because it adds more credibility to their dossier. If you choose to do that, you have to wait for a letter of no objection from FDA, and then you are federally compliant again. So if you notify, you run the risk of FDA having comments and basically asking you to do more requirements to get a GRAS. Looking at the big picture, there are 3 points where you can be federally compliant. The first is doing the rulemaking process and FDA approval process of a food additive petition. And the second is if you were to do a generally recognized as safe, you get it reviewed by an expert panel. At that point, you are also federally compliant. The third is once you get the expert panel review, you decide to notify the FDA. Once you're at that point, you have to wait until you address all the questions and concerns of FDA reviewers. And once you do that and they have no further questions, they will issue what is called a letter of no objection, and then you are also federally compliant. This is a high-level overview of an FAP. The dossier format must be compiled in accordance with 21 CFR 571. There's no data publishing requirement. The approval method is reviewed by FDA and the rulemaking process. The estimated cost with studies is $380,000 to $700,000. This is per the Red Book's Concern Level 2 recommendations. And the time to approval with studies is approximately 5 to 8 years, or more in our experience, to receive approval. For GRAS, the dossier format is to be a narrative of safety that adheres to FDA's Substances Generally Recognized as Safe Final Rule published August 17, 2016. There is a publication requirement. The safety studies must be published in a peer-reviewed journal to meet the requirement of generally recognized. And the approval method is by expert panel review with an optional FDA notification. The cost with studies is about $380,000. And the time to approval with studies is about 20 to 26 months from project initiation to FDA approval. Okay, so which option works best for you? While there are some exceptions, GRAS is often the best path for many novel ingredients. The reasons include, first, that there is a shorter timeline to market than an FAP. The second would be that the GRAS safety study requirements are more flexible than the FAP. which is subject to Red Book recommendations for studies. And the third is the GRAS programs are often much cheaper than FAP programs because of more flexibility with safety study requirements. Well, I've done my best to provide a high-level roadmap for most novel ingredients. Each ingredient is different and has a different unique scenario. So if you are interested in a roadmap, Burdock Group can help. And the way we can help is with what's called a feasibility assessment. The purpose of a feasibility assessment is to explore the scientific literature for relevant studies, to conduct a regulatory assessment, address the data gaps, and outline the program that achieves GRAS for your ingredient. If you have a question about GRAS, feasibility assessments, or just have a question about ingredient safety and regulation, please feel free to reach out to us at info@burdockgroup.com. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Danielle. Our next speaker, Maya Skubak, is a partner in the patent prosecution group at Wilson Sonsini and is a member of the firm's board of directors. Maya's focus is on developing offensive and defensive IP strategies for life science companies. Such companies include synthetic biology, companies making recombinant proteins for various applications, as well as more traditional pharmaceutical and nutraceutical companies. In addition to working with companies, Maya assists investors in conducting IP diligence before financing events. We're going to handle this portion a little bit different. We'll first have a short PowerPoint on Maya and Wilson Sonsini outreach, and then we'll spend some time live on various topics. So queued up.
Hi, my name is Maya Skubak, and I'm a partner in the Patents and Innovations Group at Wilson Sonsini. I'll give you a brief overview to our firm, my group, and what life science companies need. First, Wilson Sonsini. Wilson Sonsini is an international firm with offices in the United States, Europe, and China. We work with companies of all stages, including VC-backed privately held companies, public companies, and multi-billion-dollar international enterprises. We support these companies with practice areas shown on this slide. For life sciences clients, we have over 1,000, and we work closely with our corporate groups to help them through M&A deals, capital market deals, venture rounds, and various collaborations. We also help them obtain over or close to 1,000 patents a year. We do this with a group that has over 180 patent attorneys and patent agents dedicated to the life sciences. These are individuals mostly with PhDs in technical areas such as polymer chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry, molecular biology, and chemical engineering. This group is the largest patent prosecution group in the United States with this expertise. Our group also includes numerous senior USPTO executives. Many areas, many clients of the firm focus on food tech, ag tech, synthetic biology, and therapeutics. As a group, we work to develop IP strategies for these clients. This includes providing them with best practices to capture all company IP, monitoring of third-party IP to avoid surprises, pursuing nuclear claims that block competitors, developing a patent strategy that aligns with their business objectives, and also helping them protect their company trade secrets. The above efforts help clients with their other legal needs, such as corporate finance and technology transfers. Our firm also has other practice areas that help with venture financing, IPOs, M&As, technology transactions. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually used Wilson Sonsini to do some patent work for me many years ago on a project. It took a considerable long time before we finally couldn't persuade or couldn't go or found out that the patent was not defendable. What's the fastest today that you can get someone to a patent?
Tom, thanks for the question. And so I'll answer the question first about speed, and maybe I'll just comment on defensibility later on. On speed, one can get a patent these days in up to a year, even less than a year if you really push the pedal to the metal and get a little bit lucky. Oftentimes when companies come to a patent attorney, the first thing they want to do is get something on file, but they want to do it in the cheapest way possible. And the first thing that a patent attorney offers at that point is a provisional patent application. A provisional application will sit there for a year, will never mature into a patent, and will require further work a year down the line to actually just get the process started. If speed is of the essence, then one should not be filing a provisional patent application, but rather a regular utility application. Moreover, there are ways in which you can accelerate the prosecution. One way is to just file for what is called a track 1 application. Track 1 applications basically put the application first in queue. You can get a first office action within 4 months and really start the prosecution there at that point. The PTO will guarantee at least 2 office actions within the first year. Moreover, when you do file for a track 1 application, you can ask for what we call a pre-first action interview. This really gives you an opportunity to present your case, your invention to the examiner before examination begins. It really lets you orient the examiner to the invention before they start doing additional prior art searchings, and it helps a lot in informing that relationship that you want with the examiner to really get a patent quickly. Some other ideas in trying to get the patent in less than a year. First, it's really focus your invention, and by that I mean focus the claim to something that is patentable. That requires that you do a prior art search before you make a filing, that you really understand what the prior art is in the context of your invention, and that you narrow the scope of the claims to be not only novel and new, but also to tell a story. Why is your invention not obvious in view of all of the art that has occurred and the publications that have occurred prior to your filing date? Once you then file the application with claims that are relatively narrow, again, you want to interview with the examiner. You want to get to know the examiner. You want to understand the examiner's perspective, their pinch points, where they feel uncomfortable, and then move the case forward by responding relatively quickly to every communication from the patent office. I think the shortest turnaround that we've ever been able to get a patent is around 4 months. In that particular instance, the examiner was already familiar with the technology, and it was a second follow-on filing that we made in a patent family. And by just presenting narrow claims that the examiner knew the art, we were able to get the client patents at a really lightning speed. But even if it's not 4 months, a year is really doable with all of the information that I just gave.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe I'll make one more comment, Tom, because you did mention something about defensibility. So that is a different question than speed. We can get patents, but the question is, will you be able to actually use those patents and enforce them against a competitor? Because that's where the value is. And that is a different analysis altogether. Part of it is really understanding whether you'll be able to, once you get a patent, will you be able to detect infringement? Or are you patenting a research tool, something that you're doing, the company, behind closed doors, which nobody will know if you're doing it, but similarly, you will not be able to figure out if a competitor is doing it behind closed doors. So that's, I would say, a different question, and also something you should be considering before spending the money on getting a patent. I'll pause here.
Well, that really leads into the another question then. What are the main considerations for a company to deciding whether to file patent protection versus just keeping the technology as a trade secret?
Tom, that's a great question, and one that's really important for companies to consider. Patents are not cheap. We sort of say patenting is a sport of kings. And so some of the main considerations that one should consider include the ability to actually enforce the patent, which is what I mentioned earlier. Another thing to consider is, will you be giving somebody an advantage by disclosing, for example, a platform, a research tool, not being able to enforce it, but letting competitors get up to speed and maybe develop their own products in this space? So that's another important point. Trade secrets also, unlike patents, don't expire. So to the extent that Coca-Cola can maintain its recipe confidential, that recipe could last and be their trade secret for many, many years. The whole idea of getting a patent is it's a quid pro quo. You have to disclose to the whole world how to make and use your invention. And so even if you do get a patent on something that might be valuable, you should know that the patents last 20 years. That right of exclusivity lasts for 20 years. And after the 20-year period, you will need other forms of protection to protect the technology. So thinking about the duration, thinking about your ability to actually detect infringement, and also thinking about the subject matter of the invention. If your product is a natural product, those are not patent eligible in the United States. If it's an isolated molecule from a natural product, not patentable in the United States alone. And so you really need to consider the ability to actually get a patent in the area that you're interested in.
Okay. And what's the difference? You had mentioned something, or you commented a couple times on within the US. What's the difference between getting just a US patent versus an outside the US or an international patent?
Right. So patents, I suspect, as most of the audience knows, are jurisdictional, meaning a US patent gives you the right to exclude others from practicing the invention in the United States, but not anywhere else in the world. So if your invention is a particular way for culturing algae, if you get a US patent, that's great, but nothing will prevent a competitor from performing the same processes in Canada. And so one consideration is, where is your market? Where will you want to file the patent? Other considerations include that there are different rules on what is patentable and what isn't in different jurisdictions. The examples that I gave earlier about natural products being not patent eligible in the United States, those rules do not apply in other jurisdictions. Isolated products could be patentable in countries outside the United States. So that's something to keep in mind. Other differences are the ability to file a provisional application, which again, most companies like to do. This is a US animal. There is no such thing as a provisional application outside the United States. And so a lot of foreign companies do take advantage of that. But in other instances, if you are a company and performing all of your inventions in Canada with no ties to the US, it depends whether you can file a US provisional or not. You may need to go through a review to make sure there's no export violation before you file in a jurisdiction that's not your own. And then I would say the final major difference between US patent law and foreign law is publications. So in the United States, you get what is called a grace period. If you happen to have published or disclosed your invention publicly, you have a 1-year grace period to file for US protection. That is not the case in most other countries. If you publish on your invention, or somehow anyone else publishes on your invention, there is no grace period outside the United States, and it could be a damaging publication and an inability to then get patent protection.
Okay. James kind of talked about from the investor's viewpoint. What happens, or does an investor look into detail about the patents and the value there? Or what's their approach?
Right. And so investors in the life sciences and in the algae space will want to understand first, what are the assets that they're investing in, whether it's $2 million investment or $200 million investment. There's got to be some assets. You as the company will be identifying those assets to the investors, and they will want to see, how are you protecting those assets? And so first and foremost, there needs to be an articulated IP strategy to the investors. And that strategy could be of mixed forms of intellectual property. It could be a combination of patent protection and trade secret protection. And it all needs to make sense. So for example, if there's a patent protection strategy, you need to show that those patents are defensible. Like I mentioned earlier, they're patenting elements of the assets that you can detect infringement, that those patents are filed in jurisdictions that are relevant to your market, and ideally that you have issued granted patents in those jurisdictions. The demonstration of an issued patent is much more validating than just a pending application or a provisional filing with no claims. To the extent that certain aspects of the assets are not protected by patents, investors will want to understand, how is the company protecting those assets under trade secret protection? Do you have an IP policy in place? Have all, they will always check to see if all employees have signed agreements that have a PIIA provision, which really assigns all of their intellectual property to the company. Is the data within the company accessible to all employees? Or is certain data protected and available only on a need-to-know basis? Is there training within the company on IP policies and how to maintain material confidential? All of those things will be diligenced. And I sort of see it as a sort of a sloping line, in the sense that the greater the investment, the more investors will diligence the portfolio, the higher the expectations are, right? For the first Series Seed, Series A, it's okay if you don't have maybe issued patents, so it's really appreciated. By the time you're looking to raise 9 digits, there got to be some issued patents in the portfolio, and really well thought out strategy on what is not in patent protection and what is maintained as a trade secret. So first component, just to recap what I just said from an investor perspective, they'll want to see that the company owns all of its IP through consulting agreement and employment agreements, and that there's a good strategy in place between, I focus more on patents and trade secrets, but to the extent that there are copyrights and trademarks and service marks as well, those will be looked at, but to a lesser extent. And then another important component is review of third-party IP and a confirmation that, in fact, the company's business or proposed business does not infringe or misappropriate third-party intellectual property. So, for example, if the company is planning to commercialize and make its great plans as presented to the investors, will they be infringing a third-party patent? And if the answer is yes, then you need to be able to already explain to the investors how is the company mitigating that risk. Are those patents available for licensing? Is it a university piece of IP? Or is that a patent that's in the hands of a direct competitor that you will not be able to get access to? And then maybe you need to come up with a different strategy, somewhat of a litigation-based strategy to kill those patents, for lack of a better word. And so that part, we call it freedom to operate. So not only does the company need to show to investors that they own the intellectual property that protects their assets, but also that they're free and clear and not entangled with third-party intellectual property. Or if there are any issues, you need to really clear the deck or have very thoughtful explanations to why it's not going to become have a material effect on the business.
Okay. Well, thank you. And there will be more questions. We do have quite a few questions showing up now. So hit your Q&A if you do have questions. And thank you, Maya, for this presentation. And we'll move on to the next one here. I have the last presentation. I have certifications in public accounting, economic development, and global management accounting. And I'm currently the tax and biotech manager for Carlson SV LLP. I've provided consulting in business structure, tax consulting, feasibility studies, financial modeling, business plan prep, equity meetings, organizations, startup management, grant applications. In the past, I've served as CFO and COO of non-GMO organic food ingredient processing companies. And I have also led the development of large-scale renewable biomass projects worldwide, including ethanol, algae, agriculture to waste, biodiesel, and wind projects by coordinating from concept to construction. Carlson SV LLP started in 1958 as a certified public accounting firm. Recently, the firm underwent a name change to Carlson SV LLP. Our team consists of 70 full-time personnel in 7 offices located through Minnesota and Wisconsin with worldwide clientele. So you can cue up the presentation.
Hello, and thank you for being part of the Algy 101 presentations. Since the late 80s, I've been helping businesses develop their business concepts or innovative ideas into financially successful businesses. I've also provided financial forecasting data to help clients determine when developing a business around a concept is not the best strategy and another approach to monetize the concept should be considered. Not only is a strong financial model necessary for obtaining financing, but it will also provide you and your development team an understanding of the timeline and cash needed to get the product to cash flow and to provide the financial returns for you and your investor. In my economic development studies, I once read that more businesses approach financial stress because of too many sales rather than the lack of sales. This is due to a lack of an understanding of an operating cycle of a business and the operating cycle's impact on cash. In simplest terms, an operating cycle is the time it takes between when you need to spend cash to the point you receive cash back on the product. In this example, you order your raw materials and pay for them. That starts the operating cycle. It takes 30 days to receive the material. It takes the company 10 days to make the product, which means that they are ordering product every 10 days. It takes another 10 days for packaging, quality control, and prep and storage or shipping. The product might sit in inventory for another 20 days, maybe while the remainder of the order is completed or while it is being prepared to ship and eventually shipped. Your payment terms you might offer also impact when you receive cash. 30 days sometimes means you really don't get paid until 45 days. In this example, your operating cycle is 100 days. During that 100 days, you have paid out cash for raw materials several times at $50,000 per batch. Manufacturing wages at $2,000 per day, overhead wages, rent, utilities at $1,100 per day. From the point the raw materials were purchased to the point you received the cash from the customer, the cash outlay, which would be your operating loan, it gets to about $880,000. I did not calculate the cost of money in this simple example, but in pricing your product, you need to take that into consideration. The operating cycle can be managed. You can negotiate terms for the raw materials that you need, and you can also negotiate with your buyers to pay up front. Now moving to financial modeling, I'm going to focus more on the thought process needed to build a useful and strong financial model than the mechanics of the model. Visualization of the operation of the business is key to building a strong financial model. This is a process where you think through in detail what it will take to accomplish each aspect of the operation. This process allows you to find weaknesses in your business concept and correct them before making presentations to outside parties. A good detailed financial model should bring to light the amount and timing of operating loans and cash needed to cover the operating cycle. It's important to be realistic when you develop a good financial model, which means don't lie to yourself. Use solid assumptions to build the model. Double check your formulas and math, and do not change your assumptions to get the results you want. A good model will show if you should continue to move forward to commercialize the concept or to take a look at another alternative to monetizing the concept. This is an example of the amount of detail I like to develop when I'm building a financial model. This is more detail than you would provide in an initial presentation to a potential debt or equity group, but it's detail you should build into your model so it will stand up at the point when you reach the due diligence stage. It is also part of not lying to yourself about your production process. It's important for you to build and understand the cost of your operation. This was an open system, so there were only a few months during the year the weather was conducive to growing this particular cultivar of algae. Seasonality will clearly impact the operating cycle. They did plan and utilize the ponds for other cultivars during the off periods to keep the sales going. I always try to build a fairly detailed production labor section. Keep in mind that there are usually state and local grants that are tied to the number of new employees hired. I'm again back to when you build the model, you need to visualize or think in detail how the portion of the operation is going to run. This allows you to think through in detail the operation and how many individuals will be needed and when you will need them. You also need to think through at what point you need to add production staff. I've seen forecasts that do not change the staff when production has changed significantly. They are either going to be overstaffed or understaffed at some point during the operation. Your research and development staff most likely are more stable than the production staff as it relates to the anticipated sales and the size of the team to meet that production. This allows you to think through what it will take to maintain a competitive advantage and to develop new products in the process. The financial forecast should be set up utilizing the same accounts as you will use in the company's financial reporting. I generally will take the finances on a monthly basis for the first 24 months, quarterly reporting for 2 years, and prepare an annual statement at the end. In any case, I summarize them on an annual basis. It is important to then compare year to year, as this is one place you can catch programming or concept errors. This is just the liability and equity side of the balance sheet. I'll talk about the zeros down below in a minute They are just check numbers that prove that your balance sheet balances. And it's very embarrassing to be in the middle of a presentation and discover your balance sheet is not in balance. The forecasted profit and loss statement will have the same periods as the balance sheet. One of the interesting things in this slide is that we made the assumption that the number of competitors would increase, so the pricing of the product would decrease starting in year 4. Notice how the gross sales and the gross profit percentage start to drop. This proves that you are realistic and you are trying to anticipate situations that the funder might bring up. This is just the next step on the profit and loss statement. The key is to address the sales and marketing of your product. There is a difference between the sales staff and the marketing staff, but both are combined under one category. Expenses. This is also one of those times you need to think through each line item. Some of the items may not change over time or with an increase in sales, but others might. Consider rent. Maybe once you reach a certain level, you will need to rent more space. Repair and maintenance is one item I find most companies underestimate. If you use equipment, it will need maintenance. Maintenance will also increase as the equipment ages. The portion of the profit and loss statement can be set up several ways. I did put the depreciation expense in the general and administrative expenses. Sometimes I have it in this grouping because it gives you the earnings before depreciation, interest, taxes, and amortization, known as EBITDA, which is a key analysis figure often used. This statement will point out the operating cycle issues. It basically starts with the income and adds back non-cash expenses like depreciation and amortization. It shows your changes in operating cycle impacts like inventory, accounts receivable, accounts payable. It also brings in changes in debt or equity that is added or paid down. It then will give you your net cash you have at the end of the period. These periods will match the balance sheet periods and the profit and loss periods. This is the bottom part of the cash flow statement where you can see how your cash has been impacted and what the cash balance is at the end of the period. All three statements are related and need to be developed together. When I set up a financial model, I take the net income figure from the bottom of the profit and loss statement. That becomes my first line on the cash flow statement. It also goes into the equity section on the balance sheet. Also, from the cash flow statement, the bottom or the ending cash is the cash figure that appears on the balance sheet. And like I had talked before, if your balance sheet is balanced and these are all zeros, then all your statements are in sync. If they are not zeros, they are not in sync. Know and understand the company's operating cycle. In financial modeling, do not lie to yourself. If you have developed a model with realistic assumptions and the model does not show the financial success you want to show, do not just adjust the assumptions so it works. Use it as a tool to go back through and see if there are calculation errors or if some of the assumptions can be managed differently. There will be many times where the project just will not financially work. This is my contact information. If you have any questions, comments, or want to help with developing a model, feel free to contact me. Thank you for listening to this presentation.
Okay. We've got quite a few questions that have popped up for our Q&A section. If we can bring our panel back. Is James there? Our first question was to James.
I am here, but my video is unavailable.
Unavailable.
It says
Okay.
can't start because the host has stopped it. Never mind, he's just let me in. There we go.
Hey, we're all back. There we go. Now we got Dave. The first question came up for you, James. Can you please explain how you find or identify investors that will have the right perspective and be interested in the Algy story?
Yeah, so I put a quick try of an answer on that because it's a tricky question. I think at this point, the Algy story is like talking about the, healthcare story. You're going to have investors who are interested in oncology or cancer, but that would not be interested in, infectious disease. You're going to have Algy investors who will be interested in food, but would not be interested in chemicals that are made from algae. You're going to have other investors who would be interested in agricultural uses, but would not be interested in human food uses. You're going to have other investors. And so algae is a massively broad industry with a lot of different opportunities. And so the best opportunity, I think, at this point to get a venture capitalist or a for-profit investor would be to single one out who's in the niche area that your algae solution fits. And so as opposed to finding, I think, without being crazy, I think I am the only algae VC investor that is interested in algae generally. Other VCs might be interested in, if you're in the pigment space or you're talking about ink from algae, there's a group of investors that would be interested in that. And if you're in the, aquaculture feed space, there's a group of investors who are interested in that. And they would be both venture capital investors that would be interested in that industry. So if you have feed for, the aquaculture industry that is algal based, venture capitalists who have invested in traditional aquaculture industries will probably also be interested in what you're doing because they're in that vertical. And so I think as we're just starting what I called, Algy 3.0 this year in 2020, there are not really venture capital investors who are interested in algae as an asset class. And so I think you really need to, as an algae business person, you need to find investors that are interested in your niche. So it's a bit of a cop-out, but I think if you want to be successful, you want to find people who are investing in the area that you're working in. There really aren't venture capitalists who are interested in algae, really, other than me. And so if somebody has something interesting in algae, I'm always interested. But I don't know of any other VCs that like algae as an asset class.
Okay, thank you. The next question really goes out to pretty much everybody. It started to focus on David a little bit more. Do you consider that VC investors are interested in investments in developing countries? Since the dollar is worth more, there is less competition and a huge market for to be explored. One of the pillars of the company is low-cost biotech. So it's kind of asking, is there more of an opportunity in developing countries or in the US or developed countries?
Okay, I'm going to take a stab at that, but I'll let James, add his bit to it because I think he's going to have more of an investment perspective on this. I'm talking about from the private sector entrepreneurial side. In my experience, investors will go where there's a profit to be made. It's that simple, whether it's a developed country or a developing country, and that really is the core issue. Do you have a viable working company and business that they can see how they can get a return? What is the exit strategy for them? Now, of course, this also takes into consideration, are you talking about US companies or European companies? that are investing in developing countries. As then the issue of currency exchange comes into play. But within these developing countries, you also have to look at what, what the appetite is within those countries for investing in the algae space. And I think we need to, and this is sort of, segueing from James's last response, we need to educate the investment community. We need to bring to them the information that is pertinent now. Because here's the thing, I've been to several pitch events. You go and you stand in front of a group of investors and you tell them about algae, and you realize that from the time they hear the word algae, their eyes kind of roll up in their heads, simply because they are working off of the events of what I call the algae biofuels bubble. 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was a lot of money being thrown at algae biofuels that were based on investors seeing or hearing the statements that are being made. We can replace petroleum by 2010, and none of that materialized. So in one of my presentations, I started the slides off with algae industry is the industry that cried wolf. That's really what it is. So whether you're in a developing country or a developed country, it is about regaining investor confidence. How do you get them to look past the burns that they got from throwing money at algae 10, 15, 20 years ago to have nothing materialize out of it? And the same goes. So we have had a lot of money come into the algae industry since the 70s. And even before that, there was a lot of money looking at, but it was from the public spend. I can't speak to like Europe and the Far East and so on and how their governments viewed it. But here in the US government really took a huge chunk of the spend to develop the industry, but for biofuels. And now we're pivoting. So to really answer this question, you have to say, yes, they'd be interested, because if you're opening up new markets in developing countries, and there's a lot to be said for the incentives that a business might have in a developing country. So let's say Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I'm from, so I can speak to that. If you are in that space where the government is willing to give you incentives, like operating in an economic zone, where you don't have to pay taxes, where they facilitate repatriation of proceeds, where they give you low utility costs for a period of time. All those sorts of things can help build a business plan. Now, I had approached the Export-Import Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, and they were very excited about it. They actually approved a loan for me doing the business in Trinidad and Tobago. So if you can, again, it's all about the story. And James, focused on that as well. How do you tell a story that captivates the audience that you're looking to attract? So for the investors, it's about what are you trying to do that's going to make us a return? So it doesn't really matter where you are, developing country or not. That's really what has to be focused on.
Okay, thank you. The next question is kind of focused on Janelle a little bit here. If you've got a grass, or for a grass, does every company have to apply for it separately? Or if a product has been declared to have grass, do the other companies need to apply separately?
Well, I guess this really starts with, the parts of grass. Now, as I mentioned, once you get grass, it's approval for the ingredient and ingredient use. So what that means is that it's not necessarily per your unique ingredient. Every company does not necessarily have to submit a grass for their, let's go back to spirulina. Not every single spirulina producer needs to submit a grass if the grass specifications are similar. So if we assume that the spirulina has been approved at that example of 10 milligrams per kg a day, if your spirulina specifications match what has been shown to be safe, and you're using it in accordance to what has been shown to be safe, you don't have to submit another grass. But, there are all kinds of variations and processes that can affect specifications, like the production process. And so that can impact what the actual final end product looks like or what it's composed of. So that changes things a little bit. So you really have to be careful when you try to go and say, oh yeah, it's grass already. You first have to ask yourself the question of, do my specs match? Am I using it for the same species? And am I using it under the same concentration? So in short, yes and no. It depends on the 3 factors I just mentioned.
Okay, thanks. This next one really goes for everybody, and I think we've touched on it a little bit. For those who have been away from algae conversation for a while, can you comment on the biofuels? Looking for someone to give a quick primer or how the biofuels dynamic has changed for algae. There's been some passing concepts on this, but can we get some comments on where biofuels are in algae?
I'll jump on that. I think the reality is the engineering and the science is not there yet to make biofuels competitive. But I will say, there are specialty biofuels. I don't want to get too far off topic, but just as an example, and I'm not a scientist, right? I'm a financial guy, but my understanding is that algal biofuels has a different freeze point than petroleum biofuel. And so, with new unmanned drones, you can fly a drone higher without the fuel getting, freezing and different problems. And so for the Navy and the military, they're willing to pay a price per gallon for fuel for a jet plane that won't freeze, that is far in excess of what a commercial airline would pay, because they have a big, if ground radar can only go to a certain level, and that you can't fly drones above that level today, but with algae biofuel, you could fly above that and you could avoid detection by ground-based forces. They'll pay, hundreds of dollars per gallon or more. And so if you have a specialty use, there may be some ways we can, develop the science now. It's no different than, Tesla came out with the Roadster. It was $250,000. Then the S, it's $100,000. Then the 3, and it's $40,000. The first algae biofuels are going to be very expensive and they won't make sense. And the stories that were told, as David and I said, back in the 90s and 2000s didn't make sense. 10 million, we'll be producing 10 million gallons per year. But synthetic genomics, the Craig Ventnor and Exxon project, is saying they will have 10,000. They will be able to make 10 million barrels, 10,000 a day, with no problem at about 225, as I understand it, US dollars per gallon. So you're getting pretty close there. But that's by 2025. I don't think there's any investor who would, short of a new technological or engineering breakthrough, that would look at biofuels in the next couple of years.
Okay, thank you. Back to regulatory question. Given the length of time and cost involved in a food additive petition, what would be the reason or advantage to this process over a GRAS process, if any?
I guess it starts with which industry you go into. And I think the line is pretty clear of food versus animal feed industry. While both of them are subject to food regulations, in practice, they do operate a bit differently in terms of regulatory. Starting with the human food industry, I'd say there really isn't any advantage and to do an FAP versus a GRAS, and GRAS is the industry standard and the recommended path. The only reason to do an FAP and go directly with FDA is if they want you to, if they tell you to. And usually that happens if it's a high profile ingredient or it's an ingredient that's going to go into high risk populations like children. So 2 key examples of FAPs for human food would be, first is aspartame. Aspartame is an artificial sweetener, and a lot of children drink a lot of sweet things. So that was mandated by FDA. They wanted to have a more hands-on approach on looking at safety data. And this hasn't happened yet, but if you pay attention to things like CBD, that's something FDA has expressed that they will not accept the grass on. They want to have an FAP because it, in effect, creates a regulation. So they want something that's more official as opposed to a grass. So other than those high profile or high risk exceptions for human food, there really is no reason. On the flip side, for animal feed, I would recommend that there is an advantage for an FAP. And the reason is, without going into too much detail, that there is the presence of state animal feed regulators and their own spheres of influence in animal feed side, and that complicates things. So you're not only just dealing with all 50 state regulators, but you're also dealing with FDA. So if you just go with an FAP, sometimes it's a little bit more advantageous to just do an FAP in animal feed space. And there are other positives and negatives to that, but it really starts with the industry. Human food, not much of an advantage. Animal feed, there might be.
Okay. And just kind of a follow on to that one, and probably to Maya a little bit. Do you deal with companies that go through the process that Janelle's talking about, or maybe getting the patent, and that's as far as they want to go? And so you have to come up with a value for that, the accomplishments, I guess, of getting to the regulatory stage and getting the patent stage?
Can you please define a little bit more of the value? Like, can you just repeat the question?
Well, it probably is more because on the patent, I guess what I'm looking for is, this is a process that takes time, both from the patent standpoint and from the regulatory standpoint. Is there then a value so a company can look at it and say, well, I don't really wish to commercialize this, but I've gone through all this process, gotten the patents. Is there a value there that you look at? And Maya, maybe start that.
I think, yeah, maybe I'll take that. I sort of see them as two parallel paths, right? Getting the GRAS approval or other FDA approval, that's one path. And that's really, I would say, the most, not to belittle what I do, but that's the foreign foremost. If you can't get through that, if there's obstacles because your GMP manufacturer, if you have obstacles in actually getting FDA approval, that's a showstopper. So you got to get that done and meet your milestones for that. And if you're not going to develop that product, anybody who's going to be acquiring your company, they're going to diligence that regulatory side of things. They're going to want to understand why you do or do not have clear paths to get such approval. And then separately, the patents, you're going to have to show that's a separate path. And if you have a good story to tell to investors of why you will get the patents, and they will appreciate that, and that shouldn't slow you down from doing an M&A, for example, and selling the company or selling the product. And so I do work with several companies in the food space, and again, they sort of see these as two separate processes. The FDA is really, that's the obstacle, if you will, to starting to commercialize a product. So you need to clear that out. Technically, you can sell a product and not have any patents. So patents is just the extra icing that makes sure that tells the investors and the company that no other company can come and sell a similar product. But if you don't have FDA approval, you just don't have a product. You can get patents and not have FDA approval, and that doesn't really help you.
Just to add a little bit more to that, and I definitely agree with you, Maya. There's a lot of strategic aspects that come along with these regulatory and legal work that people need to do. And in the case of for regulatory, it really is a strategic impact on your clients, people who want to buy from you or want to acquire you. You're right about them doing due diligence. They're going to want to know that you took your patents, that you got your product approved. And so keeping that in mind is that regulatory and legal is not just a hurdle to sell, it's also a strategic consideration to sell better. Because once you get to the certain stage or, playing with the big players, they're going to vet you out.
they want to make sure that you've done your due diligence and that your IP is protected. So just building off that.
Okay, thank you. Next question is a little bit, it goes out to anybody. They're looking for some ideas of what companies have been successful, what algal companies have been successful, and can we look at their business models? Which and with that, which algal products currently consider the most profitable out there? Anybody pick up on that, or?
I'll take a stab at it, Tom. This plays into a number of other questions, so you might find answers overlapping. But you have to understand that algae industry players keep their cards very close to their chest. It costs money to get that kind of information. Your best bet to understand the algae landscape is to join the major trade organizations. I'm sorry, I'm not selling a product here for ABO, but ABO, the European Algae Biomass Association, get involved in those kinds of organizations wherever you are. And they would usually have some fairly reliable data. Otherwise, you could find yourself spending upwards of $4,000 or $5,000 for a market research report that may or may not have reliable information in it. So it's all about what the industry players are willing to tell you. And at this stage in the game, very few are willing to tell you what they're doing and what's successful and what isn't. Unfortunately, for the most part, a lot of it is illusory. it's an illusion. I'm sorry to be saying this, but you have to dig really deep, and you have to know how to analyze the performance of a company based on what information is made public. But to say that there's a definitive list of successful algae companies and to be able to have access to what their business models are, I can't point you to any single direction. You could go to the Algae Biomass Organization and you'll see who the member companies are. And you could see who's at platinum, who's at gold, who's at silver, who's, those kinds of things. And that'll give you a sense of who is, operating in the space, at least, and who has the capital, the disposable income, to be able to hold that position in an organization like the ABO. But you'll see, if you look back historically, you'll see how many changes have occurred. And a company that appears to be doing really well today might be gone tomorrow. So there's no easy way to give you that sense of security in terms of looking at what has been done, what has been successful, which is what I guess the person is asking. The algae products that are currently being considered as the most profitable business, the ABO is now leading the pivot for the industry to food and feed. Okay. And looking at all those other areas aside from biofuels. And this sort of pivots off of a question that James answered earlier in terms of biofuels and where we are with that. When I first started looking at algae, I won't say how long ago it was because I'll be carbon dating myself, but you read so many peer-reviewed papers talking about the search for biofuels, what they were doing. And biofuels was a targeted product. And everything else that they found were considered to co products or byproducts of that process. Now that has flipped. And people are starting to focus on what was previously considered to be the co-product fraction. And biofuels are now something that if we get it, we like it. But the problem with the biofuels has always been the economic feasibility. When you can lift a barrel of petroleum from the Middle East for $8, you start looking at those economics. And then you start looking at the fact that, one, petroleum is a biofuel. And it's been made by nature for hundreds of millions of years at a scale that we are yet to reach. And that's been one of the major problems for getting to, commercializing a commodity like biofuel. So now the folks in the industry, they've developed all of the science and the technology to, hydrothermal liquefaction and supercritical CO2 extraction and all of those other things. Now we have to scale that up, but it is more sensible to raise the capital for something like that if you're going after a high value product. And that's where the economics start to change. So what are the more popular products now? You can look at the landscape and see there's a lot of activity going on in the food space. So ingredients from microalgae. Look at Corbion, for example, who's doing a lot of good work out there, pairing with aquaculture feed and even algal oils and so on. There's companies in Europe that are doing colored chlorella. They're doing all sorts of new and novel ingredients. And of course, the push towards non-animal protein. Algae plays a very huge part in that and has a huge opportunity there. So I would say that the alternative, what used to be called the co-products, are the areas of focus now. And you can see where the return on your investment is likely to occur in those spaces. So again, speaking personally, Algy Technologies, we're doing 2 products from microalgae. One is an algae-based soil amendment, and the other is a line of skincare that has an algal ingredient in it. So 2 extremely different market verticals from the same group of organisms. But I still say we do 2 types of skincare, because you have skincare for the human being and you have skincare for the planet, because that's what soil is. It's our skin. So again, look at it from that perspective. And it's all about, if you're getting into the algae industry, you have an idea, you have a technology, start almost from the end point. Determine what you want to make and sell before you start doing anything else. Because otherwise, if you're making something that costs $100 million to produce, but you can only sell one of it, doesn't make sense. So that really has to be what you look at.
Okay, thanks, David. The next question actually comes in for me. How do you exploit the numbers, the general financial model, considering COVID, when uncertainty and other uncertainties everywhere, implied labor costs and so forth? Well, you've got to look at COVID as kind of the black swan. It was a little unexpected. Financial models kind of get thrown off on that. For when if you're developing a model that either replicates or there is a history or commodity on it, my models are set up to use Monte Carlo analysis. So you can start to stress the model. You got to believe history is a little bit of a predictor of the future, but it's nice to stress the model so you can give a probability or a percentage of reaching such number like a debt coverage ratio or something to that effect. But that's part of thinking through each line item and going, okay, what are the impacts? I don't really build a model that can take into consideration something as unknown and that would have the worldly impact as the COVID. So let's move on. Well, can a product be registered under GRAS as well as F&D as a nutraceutical?
Okay, well, I'm not sure what F&D means or what the question is trying to clarify,
F&D, yeah.
But when it comes to GRAS is a food approval pathway. And as I mentioned, nutraceuticals are dietary supplements, and dietary supplements fall under the category of food. And while there are a little bit of differences in how dietary supplements are regulated, there's a couple of different paths there. GRAS is actually still the most viable path for nutraceuticals, provided that if you do a GRAS, you still follow those 3 rules that I mentioned. First of all, you need to make sure that if the GRAS exists already, you're following the specifications, they match. Second, you follow the concentrations. And third, you use it in the correct species. And in the case of dietary supplements, it's only humans. There are no animal feed dietary supplements. And I'm not sure if this is what you're asking about F&D. If you're talking about drugs, you can go from food to drugs. Obviously, you need the drug approval process, but you can't go from a drug to a food. So that's just I'm not sure if that's what you're asking for, but if you have a food and you start off as a food, you can eventually make your way up as a drug.
Okay, thanks. Next question, David, maybe you want to cover, or I can add something to it. The individual's really interested in the Algy Center of Excellence. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure, Tom. So I posted to the question asked by Dr. Piancos a link to the document that's available online. I can share it with you, or you can look through the Hoover app, and I'll put it up there as well. But the mission of the Algy Center of Excellence, and this is reading directly from the document, is to support the development, scale-up, and commercialization of innovative, sustainable, and eco-restorative solutions for the production of food, feed, and bioproducts from algae. So this is part of what I was explaining earlier, that the ABO is leading this thrust to focus on areas outside of the biofuel spectrum. And they've been doing a lot of work. We've set this up as a center of excellence that will have industry participants, academia. There's a technical advisory board, and I'm happy to say that I sit on that board. But it's being led by a steering committee with individuals whom I'm certain if I call their names, everybody knows immediately who they are. Stephen Mayfield, Jill Kaufman-Johnson, Mark Allen, Greg Mitchell, Dave Hazelbeck, Rebecca White, Amha Bilay, and Michael Burkhardt. These are all guiding lights in the industry. And the intention really is to use the ACE as a mechanism to increase the activity in the algae industry to develop the sustainable solutions that we're all looking for. So I'll say again, in terms, there's options to partner with the ACE. So the steering committee for the ACE is seeking partners to help launch the center. And partners would be individuals or organizations that understand the global need to develop new sustainable products, sustainably increase our food and feed supply, combat environmental destruction. And it's really about growing the US algae-based industry so that it can meet these needs and expand the US bioeconomy. Now, we are open as the ABO to partnering with the European Algae Biomass Association and other organizations that have similar interests, because we believe that it's about promoting the industry and supporting the industry, and the ACE is just another mechanism to do that.
Okay, thank you. Next question came in actually for me. In the algae industry, from my experience, is the item that costs the more and how can be fixed? Actually, in my experience working with them, the dewatering and getting to a dry product was always one of the largest costs. The other was actually in the growing, because I'm from the agricultural community, and our experience was that algae in an extent are kind of like sheep. They kind of up and die for no reason. So when you're putting together your forecast, you can't take what happened in the lab and assume that's going to continue to happen at demonstration or full scale. You are going to have crashes. And so you have to take that into consideration. But our largest issue was always the dewatering it and getting it down to a sellable product. We probably have time for one more question laid out to the group. What has been the largest hurdle to move a business forward? And could be James, could be David. Any comments?
I'll take it from the investor standpoint and why you'd put money in. The biggest hurdle is really just lack of success. And so what we need is some, the baseball analogy that VCs love to use is, you need some singles and doubles before you probably get the home runs and the grand slams. What was pitched originally was that, people were going to put a bunch of money in and that algae would be immediately successful in really large ways. And so I think, what would be helpful for the industry to move it forward would be to tell stories that are realistic and defensible, that offer small wins that investors can gain back confidence, and that with that confidence, they will continue to make larger and larger investments. And with those investments, get larger and larger wins. I will just say, from an earlier question that came out about the business models, venture capitalists, somebody asked about profitable business models. If you look at, Amazon lost money for its first 14 years, but was heavily supported by venture capital investors. Uber still loses money. Airbnb loses money. WeWork loses money. There's lots of venture capital backed businesses that have a path to profitability, even if it's far out in the future. And as long as it's realistic and demonstrable, you will find investors who will invest in longer term needs. And so if it's going to take 5 to 8 years or even 8 to 10 years, as long as there's a path to eventually getting there, I think investors will support Algy. It just needs to be making progress.
Tom, this is Maya. If I could just interject here as well, because I also work with many drug companies, and there the path to market is also 8 years is conservative with having to get FDA approval and the like. So I agree with what James said. What I'm hearing a lot is Algy, but Algy is just an engine. It's an engine that can make things at this point. We've known how to make it. And it's really all about finding, whether you want to call it the niche story, what is it that you want to make with Algy, and how is it going to help you make it in a better, cheaper, faster way than what's already out there, whether it's checker spots when their new ski that has improved performance, or it's a specific type of a cannabis that could be performed, or synthesis that can be performed better than medicinal chemistry could. So it's not just Algy. Algy, again, we know how to manipulate Algy. We know how to grow it. And it's really, what do you want to do with it? What application do you want to develop? And I do see that investors will put money if there's a good plan. And like they always say, the team really matters. People who know how to execute, and that does matter.
Okay. All right, that's going to bring us to a close here. We're getting to the top of our hour, so it kind of wraps up today's session. I want to thank all the panelists for some very valuable information, and thank all the attendees for tuning in. I trust you picked up several pieces of information and insight from this experienced panel. The next session will be held on Tuesday, August 18th at 10 a.m. Central Time, so the same time period as this one. It will be the second in the industrial spotlight sessions. It's called Algy Based on Polymers. So I believe you can keep submitting questions to an extent that they'll get on, and then, or you have the emails for the panelists. If you have a specific question, you can contact them. With that, I want to thank everybody, and have a good day. This concludes session 1 of the summit.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
Thanks to all the panelists. Really, really great session.